Well, this is an extraordinary clarinet player here tonight. And I've never heard a clarinetist play 3 huge works, one after another in one program. You must have an iron. Little clarinets have an iron. It doesn't sound that way, but it must. As Tim mentioned, Magyar Madness was written for the wonderful clarinetist David Krakauer, and he gave me one admonition when I wrote the piece. He said, I want some klezmer in it. And I said, okay, not knowing what that really meant. And I wanted the commission. So I wrote my piece, and there was no klezmer. So he said, I'm going to add klezmer to it. So he added a little bit of in the last movement. And I didn't realize that klezmer was a way of playing so that it's not just different notes, but a kind of crying sound. So Michel tonight was going to try and do that in the last movement, give it a kind of a human voice instead of just a lovely clarinet sound, a kind of sobbing, pulsating, klezmer, suffering sound, which I love the idea of. So he will klezmerize it a little more than I imagined. So it's in 3 movements. The first movement is fast and slow, but mainly a fast movement. I don't know what to say about Compassionate Nights. I forget why I called it that. Probably not a decent reason. But there it sits. And it's a normal length of a first movement, 10 minutes, 12 minutes. Then there's a movement for just the strings called Contentment, which is very short and very expressive and shows off the quartet and allows your ears to recover from hearing a clarinet. So that in the final movement, which is way longer than any finale ought to be, you will welcome the sound again. And I've been, a series of pieces I wrote around this time have hugely longer last movements than is normal. And I was inspired by that, I think it's mentioned in the program note, by a number of years ago, the piece, the Beethoven String Quartet in B flat, a late quartet, was originally written by Beethoven to include the grosse fuga as the last movement. The grosse fuga is by itself 20 minutes long. And when it was first heard, Beethoven's contemporaries were so scandalized by this that they prevailed upon him or begged him, please write me a normal length movement. This is impossible. No one will tolerate a 20-minute last movement after you've already heard 30 minutes. And for one time in his life, he agreed. So that he wrote this little movement, and it's been done that way for 100 years. And for me, only recently, I think it was in 1960, when I went to the Aspen Music Festival, the Juilliard String Quartet decided to restore it to the way it had originally been conceived. So they performed it, I'd heard it the other way, of course, but they performed it with the grosse fuga at the end. And it so transformed the piece, it just stunned me, because the piece is a series of like 5 or 6 movements, each of a reasonable length. But when this 20-minute monster appears at the end, all those earlier movements are dwarfed, and they seem somehow like they're leading up to this, or it changes the perception of the whole thing so enormously, and with such an insight into what could be done to change the so-called final movement, that I wanted to try and write something with that in mind. So that's the case with this piece. The last movement is really 20-minute concerto for clarinet and string quartet. And the title of it is The Magyar is, of course, Hungarian. And I wanted to use Hungarian melodies. I was going to say tonight that I went to the library to study, went through all the Hungarian codexes and indexes to find melodies which were Hungarian, but I didn't. I'm Hungarian in the sense that Franz Liszt was Hungarian in the Hungarian Rhapsody set. Sort of a romantic European view of, or Schubert, what inspired me with something called the Grand, what is it called? Divertissement à la Hongroise, Hungarian divertissement for piano four hands. And in that, he does little odd things in the tonality, which are quote-unquote Hungarian. And I love that piece. I've played it many times. And so I use the Hungarian in that sense. Everything has a slightly odd Slavic tinge, I like to think. But more interestingly, from my point of view, was if you're going to write a movement 20 minutes long, you need something to hold it together. It's a rondo. I think you all might know what a rondo is, where something comes back and there's a little variation that comes back, variation comes back, but always the rondo is the same. Well, in this piece, I didn't do that. I have a full-shaped, lovely rondo in the beginning, and then I gradually dismember it. So instead of arms, legs, and a head, you have half an arm, half a leg, and still a head. So it's all a little, in practical terms, faster, cut off a little bit. And then there are other contrasting material. But when the next time the rondo comes, I take off all the legs, or all the arms, and it's the torso. So in other words, it goes twice as fast, or almost 3 times as fast. And the final time, there's nothing left, practically. It all goes by in a very fast, crazy whoosh of sound. My idea being that if you hear that you get the connection from the beginning, the slow, lovely version, and gradually it gets faster and faster, more chaotic, more wild, more Hungarian. So you're hopefully pulled along, wondering what on earth can be done to this poor melody again, until it basically disintegrates at the end. But that was the idea, and how it comes out, we'll see. It is a Godzilla of a piece. The things I ask of the players is extremely hard. It's extremely it's very difficult. It's very, very romantic in the Hungarian mode, and I do terrible things with the clarinet. Composers, I loved learning a little bit about the clarinet, but it was too late in this piece, because I've learned that when you write something they can't play, they want to play it, and they'll find a way to play it, some trick fingering or something or other. Even another piece that they put something into the bell to get a low note, and if you extend the line to it, it goes lower. So this piece goes from a high B flat, which is almost the highest note on the flute, down, of course, to the low Shalyamo range, which alas I didn't vary. It's hard to do, I think. But the ability, the difficulty often comes in how floored are you going to make this? And there's breaks in the clarinet, like the breaks in the voice, which I ignore. Because a clever performer will always find a way. And as you will hear in the first piece, the incredible singing piece. I hope you enjoy this. I can't think of anything else to say. Is there time for a question or two from anyone? Yes?
How about your pieces for voice? Songs or a song cycle?
I've written lots for voice. Many, especially, I guess I'm known for having set Alice in Wonderland to music for 20 years or so. I'm not doing it anymore, but I move obsessionally. And usually an author inspires me. For a while it was James Joyce. I got very interested in his poetry, little bit there is. And because he was a lapsed Catholic, and so was I at the time. And then I got interested in Lewis Carroll, because Lewis Carroll and the world he came from, which was wit and whimsy and Victorian charm, was very in contradistinction to the way I was writing at the time, which was atonality, abstract, forbidding. So to get Lewis Carroll's spirit, I kind of, without realizing it, forsook the way I had been trained and engaged tonality. And so in a way, the only way I could do such a thing, which was very daring at the time, was to pin it on a story. I'm doing this only because this tells the story. This creates the mood. And finally, when I wrote a piece called Final Alice, which was done a lot by the Chicago Symphony and then recorded, I had kind of like reintroduced tonality as a viable product in a sort of post, people were hungry, I think, for something like that. Post aleatoric, not aleatoric, but atonality had already established itself. And people thought, certainly composers, this was the only way to go. But after they heard Final Alice, they seemed to think there were other paths to take. Yes?
Who were your early influences?
Well, I began as a pianist. So my early influences were piano composers, wonderful Chopin, Brahms, Schumann. My first teacher was a German named Bernhard Abramovich. I grew up in Berkeley, California, or I studied there, and he very much influenced me. Later I studied with a pianist named Robert Helps, who was also a wonderful composer, who taught me to play the piano in a very odd way. very physical way. I learned a lot about how that works. And I also studied with Roger Sessions and Earl Kim at Princeton University, which is a hotbed of atonality from which
I didn't hear after Roger Sessions.
somebody Earl Kim. And Princeton was, I had only been composing a couple of years when I went to college, went to graduate school. So Princeton being this hotbed of atonality scared me, and I quit after a year and bumped around New York for 2 or 3 years. My parents said, you ought to go back to school, you need a degree. So I went back and did what people do. Got a job. And what else? Good questions. Yes.
Did you ever, in your writings for Alice, do anything atonal? Because it seems to me that Alice is rife for atonality.
You're absolutely right. And in the beginning, before I had embraced tonality, I took the weirdest parts of the book, like the Jabberwocky, the monster and speaks in nonsense, that I made very atonal. But when I got to like the Mad Tea Party and Alice, that's true. Well, I did mad things with the tonality. 2 or 3 keys going on at once, or 2 or 3 rhythms going on at once, but it was tending now towards tonal madness as opposed to atonal non-madness. You can put it that way. Well, I hope you enjoy this. This is well into the world of tonality. My privilege here. Thank you.